Hello, I'm Ian Barker. I'm a senior solicitor at the Medical Defence Union, practicing in the field of medical law now for 32 years, and amongst other things representing doctors in GMC proceedings throughout that time. Today, I'd like to give you a brief explanation of the GMC approach and guidance in the face of the COVID pandemic. All of you will have huge demands being made on you at present, and it is entirely understandable that you will not want concern about complaints to your regulator to add to that burden. I will aim briefly to look at several areas. First, the general approach of the GMC in relation to complaints. Second, the issue of working in unfamiliar roles. Third, the vexed issue of PPE. And finally, something about ongoing cases. So in terms of the GMC approach generally, at an early stage in the outbreak in the UK, the GMC sought to reassure that a sensible approach would be taken to regulation. Plainly, there was an understanding that the impact and demands on doctors from the pandemic was likely to be very considerable indeed. Recognizing that, the GMC, along with other healthcare regulators, published a joint statement on the 3rd of March. They recognized the vital role which would come to be played in treating coronavirus and the increased burden this would produce. And the joint statement included this observation: we recognize that the individuals on our registers will feel anxious about how context is taken into account when concerns are raised about their decisions and actions in very challenging circumstances. Where a concern is raised about a registered professional, it will always be considered on the specific facts of the case, taking into account the factors relevant to the environment in which the professional is working. We would also take into account of any relevant information about resource, guidelines or protocols in place at the time. Dame Claire Marks has also stated that in the event a concern is brought to the GMC about your decisions or actions, along with other regulators, the challenges of the circumstances in which you are working will be taken into account. Frankly, the context in which a problem arises in practice always ought to be considered in evaluating the performance of those involved, COVID pandemic or not. That's not a criticism of the GMC in its approach now. It's right that they should say this explicitly at this point, and the statement from the regulators is a helpful and hopefully reassuring recognition of that, given the dreadful circumstances under which many doctors are presently practicing. But you can anticipate that as part of any explanation or defence on behalf of a member, we will certainly be making plain the difficult and demanding environment in which care was being provided. So in short, that will be taken into account where it's relevant. If there have been then limited resources available, if you're working in an unfamiliar area of practice, if stress and fatigue affect your judgment or performance, all these things should be properly considered in evaluating whether a problem which arises can sensibly indicate that someone's fitness to practice is impaired. The GMC has also given some thought to the threshold for embarking on an investigation about a practitioner at the present time. Anthony Omo, Director of Fitness to Practice for the GMC, has said, "We appreciate the pressures on doctors and the UK's health services and want to limit the impact of complaints and investigations. We're continuing to assess and respond to concerns received, but we are changing how we seek information from employers and doctors. We will only make a request if it involves an immediate patient safety concern. This means that we may not be able to progress some cases as efficiently as we would normally, or at all for the time being. If this happens, we'll communicate with those involved and support them as best we can. Any doctor currently involved in fitness to practice case can get in touch with us about their individual case." I don't read this as an indication that matters raised with the GMC will not ultimately come to be investigated at all, but it does seem at the present time the GMC does not intend to push ahead with investigations and to seek information unless the matter raised with them gives rise to an immediate concern about patient safety. Certainly, we have seen a dropping off in new GMC matters, and that is hopefully a reflection of the sensible approach of the GMC in dealing with things at present. May I turn then to working in an unfamiliar role? This was an understandable concern in the early stages of the pandemic, which is why we addressed it in our first video update. we can see that this remains a concern for many of you. So we'll look at this again from the perspective of the GMC guidance. For trainees, the GMC makes clear the following points. You shouldn't be asked to carry out activities beyond your level of competence. You should receive appropriate induction and supervision if you're moved to a different clinical area. In reality, for any doctor, if you are now to work outside your discipline, being provided with some induction and basic training in the area in which you're now required to work is fundamental. The GMC makes the point that doctors have a duty to recognize and work within their competence, but they do explicitly recognize that, as they say, in these exceptional circumstances, doctors at every level may be required to work at the limits of their comfort zone and in some cases beyond. When deciding the safest and best course of action in this context, the GMC advises you to consider what is within your knowledge and skills and how your existing skills could be used in a different healthcare setting. Identify what skills and experience other members of the healthcare team could offer. Be willing to seek professional advice and clinical supervision from colleagues. This may come from a senior, peer, or a more junior colleague who is acting within their usual clinical setting or scope of practice. Seek additional training and guidance as far as you reasonably can in the circumstances. This can include preparing for work in a new setting by accessing online or local training to help improve your knowledge and skills in advance. Make sure you know who to go for support and professional advice. The GMC continues, in an emergency, you should provide the safest care you can. If you think that patients are being exposed to avoidable risk, you should tell a senior colleague or manager and work with colleagues to find the best possible solution in the circumstances. Make sure to record any concerns about working outside of your competence and how this could impact on patient safety. They continue, we recognize that doctors may feel anxious about how context is taken into account when concerns are raised about their decisions and actions in very challenging circumstances. The primary requirement for all doctors is to respond responsibly and reasonably to the circumstances they face. In short, it may sensibly come down to this. Do your best to get the information and training you need. Get further advice from colleagues if you need, whoever they might be, if you are clear that they have greater knowledge and experience in the area in which you are now working. This isn't a time for status to be relevant. Consider what you can do and what others could do instead. And if patients are in danger, shout. Remember the general point that the GMC will be considering the context if there is a complaint or something goes wrong. If you are doing your very best in the most difficult circumstances, the GMC is sensibly going to take that into account. I'll turn next to a lack of or inadequate PPE and your responsibility to your patients. I appreciate this may very well be an ongoing concern for you at present. We are revisiting this issue as some of you have asked about where you would stand if you took the very difficult decision not to give particular treatment to a patient because you did not have satisfactory PPE and the GMC would have become involved. The GMC have tried to address this issue in some detail on their website. The GMC tries to be helpful, but inevitably it can give no fixed answer which would apply in a specific case. Each case will be different. As they say in their frequently asked questions, no two sets of circumstances are the same, and we would have to look at the specifics of any concern raised with us. We do not speculate on scenarios, nor do we reach any conclusions without full knowledge of all the factors involved. Understandably, GMC advice has to be based on general principles. I then have a corresponding difficulty in giving guidance, but I'll try to unpick it. Repeated at several points in the GMC guidance is the observation that a doctor's priority will be the welfare of their patient. They say at various stages, we know that a doctor's priority will be the welfare of their patients alongside their own well-being and that of the healthcare team in which they work. And they add, the fundamental duty of a doctor is to make the care of your patient your first concern. And in the same vein, we expect patient safety to be a doctor's priority, and there would be a clear conflict with a doctor's ethical and professional values if patients did not receive treatment. Understandably, this has to be the fundamental guiding principle. The GMC does say, though, that it does not expect doctors to provide care without regard to the risks to themselves or others. And we understand that particularly in these unprecedented and stressful times, doctors may also have significant concerns for their health and that of their families. When faced with a situation in which a patient requires treatment in the face of inadequate or a lack of PPE, the GMC advice includes the following. Doctors will need to consider whether treatment can be delayed or provided by another team, what course of action is likely to result in the least harm in the circumstances, whether alternative actions or additional steps can be taken to minimize the risk of transmission, whether any doctors or other healthcare professionals are at a higher risk from infection than other colleagues. You should try to work with colleagues to find the best way forward in the circumstances. Our expectation is that doctors will do their best in the circumstances they face, considering the welfare of the patient and the risk to their own or others' health to make these difficult decisions. The GMC also expects that, as they say, you should raise your concerns with your employer. You should make a record of your decisions and how you handled your safety concerns. I would suggest then that thinking things through carefully and with colleagues and weighing up the risks to you and to others and the risk to the patient then in not having the care is likely to be the order of the day. A lower standard of PPE may increase the risk in some measure, but consider if it would nonetheless allow treatment to continue. To give an example then, at one end of the spectrum, in the face of inadequate PPE and the need to treat a patient urgently, if a doctor's first response was simply to turn away with no attempt to consider anything further, including whether treatment might be performed by somebody else, one might anticipate the GMC would have concern. There may, though, be cases at the other end of the spectrum where, having applied the GMC guidance here, reviewed the position with colleagues and raised the issue of lack of PPE with management, the assessment brings you to another conclusion. In those circumstances, you will need to show that even with the patient being the priority, the decision was appropriate, that you did apply the GMC guidance, and that you've made a careful record of all of this. As the GMC says, if having tried and exhausted alternative means of treating a patient, you believe that it is not possible without unreasonable risk to you and to other healthcare professionals, you should escalate your concerns, record your decision, and how you tried to address safety concerns. Finally then, may I come to ongoing cases. Those of you who have the misfortune to be facing a GMC investigation or hearing are likely to have your own medico-legal advisor and or your own solicitor, and this isn't intended to cut across their advice. In short, the GMC took early action to suspend substantive MPTS hearings, other than those, for example, before interim orders tribunals. To explain, an interim order may be sought by the GMC where the allegations against the doctor are thought to be serious enough that, if proven, they would mean the doctor poses a threat to patients or to the public. They don't involve evidence being given to establish the truth of an allegation. They're essentially a risk assessment in the context of the seriousness of the allegation. The interim orders hearings are almost always heard in private, and that has made it easier for those to take place remotely. Tribunal members, lawyers, doctors taking part by Skype. As for the substantive hearings, though, all those that were to have taken place up to 6th July have been cancelled. Substantive hearings, which were listed for a hearing at a point after 6th July, remain listed to be heard as planned, and preparation for those cases will be continuing as best they can. That said, there may yet be further postponement of cases beyond this point, so as with so many things at present, we'll just have to wait and see. But in due course, it will mean that all those cases which were to have taken place will have to be relisted, and there is then likely to be a very significant backlog. The GMC also appreciates that seeking to proceed with an investigation may be difficult, and the pace of the investigations has slowed somewhat. The result is that if you're presently under investigation, Not only may the matter be slowed at this point, but if the matter is eventually referred on for a hearing, there may be a significant delay before a hearing slot is available. Finally, a brief mention of revalidation. If you were due to revalidate before the end of September, don't worry. The GMC has moved on your revalidation date by 1 year. And if you were due to revalidate before your next appraisal, you won't have to complete another one or collect additional information to support it. May I add a personal note, just this. I have to say I regard it as a privilege to look after members of a wonderful profession. There is a reason why the public steps outside to applaud you and your colleagues in healthcare every Thursday at 8 o'clock. I could practice as a lawyer for many more years, and no one would be doing that for mine. A sincere thank you for everything you're doing.